Hi, everyone. Let's wait for some folks to filter in. We're gonna talk today about the Nvidia RTX 3080, and we've got a very detailed review live on tomshardware.com if you go to the homepage. But for those who wanted to tune in live and ask us some questions and talk about the performance results and have a more in-depth look at the card live, or for those viewing afterwards and wanted to have a more in-depth look at the card on video, we'll be chatting about that. Since we just promoted this and scheduled it a few minutes ago, I'm gonna give it a minute for some folks to filter in before we talk about all the cool stuff that Jared has discovered, written about,
Unwrapped.
unveiled in his RTX 3080 review, which you can find right now on the homepage of tomshardware.com. So we're doing this live. We couldn't really promote it before it was published. So, but we didn't want to wait too long before we went on video and talked to everybody. So we're starting to get some folks in. Jared,
Let me give you some background on the past. So I got the card almost 2 weeks ago, maybe a week and a half ago. I can pull it up now. Hey, I've got lighting now. Check this out. Whoa! Oh wait. Where's my camera? There you go. The card is here. So I got it a week and a half ago, something like that. And of course, you have to just start running benchmarks like crazy. Got the drivers from Nvidia, and there's a ton to uncover. We've got CPU scaling results on Tom's Hardware. We'll talk about some of those as well. Got benchmarks across the board from 1080p up to 4K. Our main article focuses on 4K and 1440p to a lesser extent because, let's be honest, 1080p, unless you're running ray tracing, this is going to be very much CPU bottlenecked. I've got the numbers. I want to say 1080p was something like 20% faster than a 2080 Ti, whereas at 4K it was 20% faster maybe than the 2080 Super. Anyway, I won't bog down in the numbers too much right now, but it's a beast of a card. Here, let's flip down and show it to you. Woo! And also, just for fun here, I've got Nvidia's broadcast software running, so it's doing noise canceling on me. It's also doing auto frame right now, which I may turn off because it can be a little annoying. So you check this out. We'll turn off the auto frame effect. Ta-da! So that's on. You can see the card better now if it focuses. See, auto frame's busted. Let's just turn that off. And on the back side, this is the bottom of the card when it's stuck in the system. Just want to show this quick. So this fan spins this way. You can see how the fins are angled. I tried to talk about this in the review, but it's kind of hard to explain, so I'll show it here. It spins this way. That's the traditional way you would expect it to spin, with the fin blades biting into the air. This fan, interestingly, spins counterclockwise as well, but the fins are actually angled what you would think is opposite. I talked to Nvidia about this because I was like, wait, isn't this supposed to spin like clockwise to push air down? What's the deal? And they said, well, we did some testing and simulation, and it generates less noise spinning this way and generates more pull because it's trying to suck air up through the radiator. So I thought that was interesting. And I can tell you that it is a quiet card. This was, I don't have the exact decibel numbers, but it was the lowest fan speed of any of the GPUs that I tested for the review. Gosh, I'm sorry, that camera is just wanting to autofocus to death, isn't it? All right, let's go back to my face. We'll talk about it later. lots to cover. It's NVIDIA's new Ampere architecture. I've dug into that previously, and it has a lot of cool features. It's going to be the fastest graphics card on the planet until next week.
So, so Jared, we have some questions coming in already, and I wanted to throw them at you. Uh, Joseph asks, will the Core i7 9700K be a good CPU for this card?
Yeah, so I've run the full suite of tests. Again, you can look at the article on a Core i9 10900K. Then our standard CPU for GPU testing right now is still a 9900K, which is almost 2 years old, just like the 9700K. And then I tested with a Ryzen 9 3900X, Ryzen 5 3600, a Core i3 10100. That's a new one for us. We actually bought that for this review because I thought that'd be interesting. It's going to be pretty similar to a 7700K. The 10100 should be. It's a little bit slower, but close enough. And then I even tested with an old school 4770K, which my motherboard, an old Gigabyte board, auto overclocked. Like it was too much trouble to try and undo the auto overclock. So it's more like a 4790K. But obviously, the lower down you go, the more CPU bottleneck you get. But the 9900K and the 10900K perform just about the same. I mean, margin of error, except at 1080p medium, where the 10900K was like 5% faster overall. The 9700K, it's an 8-core 8-thread chip. Doesn't have hyperthreading. In a lot of games, that actually helps. There are a few examples where it would hurt performance. I want to say Hitman 2 and Ashes of the Singularity, I think, will both scale beyond 8-core 8-thread slightly. It's not like a huge benefit, but they will show some improvement. And I didn't test those on the 3080. I don't have either of those in my GPU test suite these days, but I suspect that the 9700K will be just fine, especially if you're running at 4K. If you're running at 1440p, it should still be within like probably 5%, maybe even 3% of the 9900K. If you're running at 1080p, I don't know. It depends on the game. So that's the long way of saying yes, a 9700K should be just fine. A 10700K is also going to be great. That's basically the Comet Lake, what do you call it? The Comet Lake version of the 9900K because it's 8-core 16-thread. And Ryzen, we can get to that more in depth later. Ryzen, the 3900X was a few percent slower. That's not too surprising. At 4K, it was only like 2% or something. At 1440p, I think it was 6 or 8% slower. The Ryzen 5 3600, not a huge change from the 3900X. We've actually seen that in the past, that it's more fundamental architectural differences between Intel and AMD and how they do things, that the 3900X and the 3600 perform quite similarly in a lot of games. So the 3900X is a couple percent faster, but that's all.
Great. So let's see what's the power limit on the card when overclocking? 110%? Joe KF?
The slider goes up to 116% in EVGA's Precision X1. I believe in MSI Afterburner it might have been 15%, so 115%. Either way, if you crank that slider up, it did make a difference. We could talk overclocking right now. So overclocking performance, there's not a ton of headroom on the GPU. It's kind of like, Ryzen is pushing right up to that red line, and it's like, hey, if you want to overclock on all cores, you might gain a couple hundred megahertz, but lose performance on single-threaded. Well, you're not losing performance with GPU overclocking, but the Ampere chip does run quite speedy at stock. I think in our Metro Exodus benchmark, which it's actually one of the most demanding games that we currently have. Power at stock was 335 watts, so even a little bit above spec, and the average clock speed over the benchmark was 1850 megahertz or so. And I know in other games I saw clock speeds more like 1920 to 1950 megahertz. With a 75 megahertz overclock, I was seeing clock speeds around around 2000 to 2040 megahertz. And if I pushed to I think it was like 85 megahertz even crashed. So, you're not going to get a huge boost, but just cranking the power slider enabled most of the overclocking benefit, I would say, because I'm only getting like a 4% increase in clock speed from the overclocking. Oh, and I didn't talk about memory. So memory is a different story because you have a new feature inside the Ampere architecture called EDR. That's error detection and retry, not correction, retry. So what it does is it finds a CRC error. It goes, hey, there was a mistransmission of that data. And instead of trying to correct it via ECC, which is usually reserved for your professional Quadro cards and stuff like the NVIDIA A100, it just retries the transmission. And it tries to do that again and again until it succeeds, which usually it probably does pretty quickly, but you're still wasting memory cycles retransmitting, but you don't crash. So the net result is that EDR allows your memory clocks to run higher, but your performance actually goes down after a certain point. So what I found in testing was I could push the memory clock up to a 1200 megahertz overclock. I don't know if that's I think GDDR6X is supposed to be quad data rate, but whatever. The effective data rate was like 21.8 gigabits per second and or 21.4, whatever it was. But performance was worse at that memory speed than at stock. And I was like, well, that's weird. And then I found out about the EDR, and I was like, oh, that explains it. So I had to drop the memory clock down and eventually settled at a 750 megahertz clock, giving 20.5 gigabits per second, and that was stable and performed better than stock and better than some other options. So I see a question.
Yes. So Luis asks, what do you think running the 3080 with i7 7700?
Again, it's going to depend a lot on your resolution. I mean, let me see something here. Do we want to jump into our CPU charts at all? What do you think,
Yes.
Avram?
Yes, let's do it.
I might have to share a second. I've got all these charts. If you're wondering, with all the benchmarking, I have like 300 charts to pull up. uh, let's see. Where's my overall? There we go. Okay. Stop sharing. And then this is a little bit raw. Sorry, guys, but share screen application. And we got my there. Can you see that?
Yes, but it's not full screen.
Oh, because the slideshow is already running. Stop sharing. Go full screen. Come on. Blah. Well, let's just stick with that for a minute. This is at 4K, and you said 7700K. That ends up being pretty much like your 10100. So you can see, compared to the fastest CPU we tested, which at 4K, interestingly, was the 9900K with DDR4 3200 memory. All of the others were tested with DDR4 3600 memory. But at 4K Ultra, the Corsair memory kit that I used for DDR4 3200 probably just has a little bit tighter subtimings than the 3600 kit, and it's like 3% faster than a 10100. A 7700K is going to be just a tad faster than a 10100, so you're probably going to fall right around the Ryzen 5 3600 level, maybe a little bit higher, but you're not losing much at 4K. 1440p, however, now you can see potentially you're losing 10%. And if we drop down to the 1080p, now you're losing maybe 20% up to. So Like it depends on what you're running. I assume anyone looking at buying a 3080 is probably running a 1440p or ultra wide 1440p monitor or a 4K monitor, in which case you will still be largely graphics card limited, so your CPU won't matter quite as much. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy a 3080 if you're running like a Haswell or a Sandy Bridge CPU, but
Um,
like you could.
Jared,
Yes.
Can you get those charts up?
Oh, did they go back away? Okay.
Yes.
Share screen. Oh, hold on. Let's see.
By the way, we have a question from Fizzy's Tech. Did you test a workload where the CPU and GPU both start bottlenecking? If so, what CPU were you running?
Uh, I don't think so. I mean, like your CPU and GPU are kind of, they're different. Um, so why is I can't go full screen on my images? It says the slideshow is already running. All right, so share screen. I'm gonna pop this over. Hey, we see that now?
Yes, but it's a little hard to see. Can you zoom in or something?
So, oh, I can scroll up there.
Okay, so that's pretty good.
I had it full screen before, and then I exited because I wanted to skip to the CPUs, and it didn't work. So here we go. CPU performance. There's 4K Ultra, and there's 2560 by 1440p Ultra. You can see slightly bigger drop. Then we go down to 1080p, and you start seeing a big gap. But again, 1080p with a brand new 3080 is kind of silly unless you're running ray tracing, maybe, and then upscaling by a DLSS, right? I've also got medium results, 4K medium, and actually the medium results weren't like hugely different overall than the ultra results. 4K is still mostly GPU bottlenecked. 1440p medium starts looking like 1080p ultra, and then of course your worst case scenarios that I tested is 1080p medium, where you're potentially losing a big chunk of performance if you're running like a Haswell CPU, or even like the 10100 I said earlier is going to be pretty similar to an i7 7700K or i7 6700K. They're both 4-core 8-thread. So, at 1080p, you're going to run into more CPU bottlenecks with such a CPU. So, anything else we want to talk about with CPUs?
No, so what kind of heat is this generating? Can you talk about the thermals?
Yeah, so thermals, let's see. Should I just skip through? Uh, Thermals are not too bad. Like I actually have a video. I'm not sure if we embedded it, but we will. Um, the thermals on the 3080 top out at around 71 degrees Celsius under sustained gaming or stress testing. So for a mark, the GPU clocks down a few hundred megahertz lower and still maintains that 71, 70, 72C range. If you measured the outside of the card, I used an FLIR camera and it said it was getting up to like 75C, but then I used a laser thermometer and it said that it was only getting up to um, about 65C. So that makes more sense. Like you wouldn't have an exterior that's hotter than the GPU itself. So thermals at stock, it's the GPU runs at about 72C maximum. And in terms of fan speeds, the fan speed was, I want to say, around 1600 RPM, which is like 500, 600 RPM lower than some of the other high-end GPUs we've tested. So that's really good on the fan speed.
So some more questions. Garrett asks, what are your thoughts on waiting for a PCIe 4 board?
I don't think it's going to matter much, honestly. So we tested on Ryzen, and that's PCIe Gen 4. And the thing is, the more graphics card memory you have, the less important your PCI Express bandwidth is, because it doesn't have to transfer as much data. The best case scenario we've seen for PCIe Gen 4 was with AMD's RX 5500 XT 4 gigabyte card, because that has an 8-lane PCIe link, and even at Gen 4 that was insufficient, or rather at Gen 3 that was insufficient. And then the moving to Gen 4 actually gave it more bandwidth, so when you were running out of VRAM, it transferred more data over the PCI Express bus, and so it helped a little bit more there. Everything else that we've tested that supports Gen 4, which is prior to this, was only AMD's Navi chips, but Gen 4 didn't really help, and your Core i9 chips would generally outperform Ryzen. I'm sure there's going to be more cases going forward where it's like, hey, PCIe Express 4 does a little bit better than PCI Express 3, but really for gaming workloads in particular, your PCI Express bandwidth isn't like the primary factor with high-end cards.
So Fizzy's Tech asks, does the PCIe 3 bus get pushed to its max?
I don't know if I actually specifically grabbed that data. I'll have to. I'd have to check back on that. I can't say. Too many things that I had to test this week, and that was not one that I paid close attention to. I think I have some logs that might show PCI Express bus utilization, but I don't have those right in front of me, so we'll pass on that question.
So here's a very practical question that I'm going to ask you. Would you buy this card now, or would you wait to see what AMD is coming out with, or wait for the price to drop? Would you recommend that folks invest in it now, or do you think it's something they should wait for? Who do you think should be spending the money on it now?
So here's the thing. We don't know for sure how fast Navi 2X is going to be. Navi 21, RX 6900 XT, whatever AMD calls it.
Can you zoom in?
Oh, yes. So this is your 4K Ultra gaming look. And you can see I've got the overclocked result at the top there. But we don't know exactly how fast AMD's Navi 21 or whatever they end up calling this card. I'm assuming it will be RX 6900 XT or something like that, but we don't know how fast it will be. We don't know price. There's rumors floating that it will be $650, maybe $700. They're just rumors. Like AMD, like either AMD is crapping its pants right now going, oh my gosh, the 3080 is really fast, or AMD is sitting over there going, yeah, we can match the 3080. We can keep up with it. But they're not saying, and they won't say until October 28th. And who knows how much data that we're going to get then. We don't know if the launch is going to be on the 28th, or it's going to be like Nvidia, where it's like, hey, here's we're going to spill the beans, and then we're going to actually do the launch 3 weeks or a month later. I would assume they're going to try their best to get out ahead of Black Friday, though. So let's assume they launch right at the end of October or early November. We'll basically know in a month, and there's a really good chance that you're going to have a hard time finding a 3080 in stock for the next month. So if you really want one and you didn't pre-order and you're not willing to spend extra money on a scalper premium, you might not be able to buy a 3080 unless you are constantly clicking that search and buy button. But would I buy it? I mean, I think the 6900 XT will probably have a 256-bit memory interface. It'll be GDDR6, not GDDR6X. It will maybe run the memory at 16 gigabits, which is still a little bit slower. So you got a smaller memory bus and a slightly lower clock speed, so it has less memory bandwidth. Bandwidth and GPU performance are usually linked pretty well together. So, if you have a faster GPU, you want to have more bandwidth. If AMD is only doing 16 gigabit or 14 gigabit GDDR6, that probably means that they don't need more bandwidth, which probably means the GPU is not as fast as the 3080. That's all conjecture. So we really don't know. Obviously, it's like there's Team Green and Team Red. I don't think anyone from Team Green is going to be super distraught about waiting for the Navi launch. And likewise, I don't think anyone from AMD's side is going to be like, oh yeah, you know what, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to wait for October or November to find out how fast Navi 2X is. So that's kind of my take on it. Like they're both going to be faster, I'm sure. AMD has said 50% better performance per watt. Let me say something about that. Nvidia says that the RTX 3080 is 90% better performance per watt than the previous generation. But that's with some serious qualifications, because what they've done, let's see, oh, where did I? There we go. What they've done is, here we've got oh, those are my Furmark numbers. I want to actually get to Metro. Hold on a sec while I skip forward to Metro. Okay. Here we go. Metro Exodus. So
Zoom.
what?
Please
Oh,
zoom.
yes. Gosh, I wish. Okay, we won't complain about that. So 3080 here is using 333 watts basically, and you've got the 2080 FE using 219 watts, right? So when NVIDIA says they're 90% better performance per watt, what they were really kind of saying is if we ran both the 2080 and the 3080 at the same frame rate, which would be 2080 frame rates, right? So you're basically saying, hey, we dropped the performance of the 3080 until it matches the 2080, then our performance would be 90% better. But then we scaled the frequency and the voltage higher in order to push performance further. And in doing so, the efficiency is definitely not 90% better at 333 watts than a 2080 at 220 watts, right? So AMD is probably saying something similar with its 50% better performance per watt. If they have a chip that's RX 5700 XT performance, they can probably run it at like 150 watts instead of 225 watts. But if they crank that up to 300 watts, then it's not necessarily going to be 50% better performance per watt at 300 watts. So we don't know for sure. Again, this is
So
an educated guess.
so we have another question for you, and I want to remind everyone who's tuned in and viewing live that we very much welcome your questions. And you can ask your questions in the chat room on YouTube, on Facebook, or on Periscope, and we get them and love to respond to them. So Garrett asks, more concerned about the next gen or TI version of the 3080. What do you think the roadmap could be for future 30 series cards?
So I don't know that there's a lot of room for a 3080 Ti. Like the Nvidia could do a refresh in a year like they did with the 20 series. But the 3090 is, on paper, it's 20% faster than a 3080. You know, it's got 82 streaming multiprocessors versus 68. It's got it's got 24 gigabytes of memory, so it's got more than double the memory, but really it's got a 384-bit bus instead of a 320-bit bus. And so memory bandwidth is about 20% higher, and the GPU T-flops is about 20% higher. And so at best, it's going to be about 20% faster. So if you're looking at a 3080 Ti, it has to fall in between the 3090 and the 3080. And I don't think there's a real need for them to try and shoehorn something in there in the near future. Maybe next summer they could do that. I guess my thing is with next summer though is, so this uses Samsung's 8N lithography, which is generally considered to be inferior to TSMC's N7 process. And TSMC now has N7P, their performance enhanced node. They've got 6N. They've got N7 Plus, which is extreme ultraviolet lithography. And Apple just announced that their new A14 chip is running or is manufactured on TSMC N5. So there's like 3 or 4 different lithography options that are all arguably better than Samsung's 8N. So next summer, Nvidia could easily shift from Samsung 8N to one of TSMC's. It might cost more to do so, but if they wanted more headroom, they could do that. And then instead of having like a 3080 Super, we might have the next generation architecture built on 5 nanometer. Will they do that? Don't know.
Fizzy's Tech asks, so it's fair to say that 3080 is 60% faster than the 2080 and 20 to 25% faster than 2080 Ti.
I think my numbers with the overall at Ultra was 30, 30 to 32% faster overall at 4K Ultra, and I want to say it's like 25% faster at 1440p Ultra than the 2080 Ti. Versus the 2080, it was like 70% faster at 4K and 55 or something, 50% faster at 1440p. Let's see. This is your percentiles chart. Let me cruise back. Sorry, zoom. So many charts, guys. There you go. So 97 versus 74 frames per second, or 97 versus 57 frames per second. So it's a healthy uplift. And I talk about this in the Ampere architecture. They've doubled the number of FP32 CUDA cores, but Turing had FP32 pipeline and int pipeline, and they could both run at the same time. Whereas Ampere, it has FP32 pipeline, and then the second pipeline is FP32 or int, but not both at the same time. So every clock cycle, or every few clock cycles or whatever, the second pipeline is shifting back and forth between int and FP32 work. So if you're talking TFLOPS numbers, even though the 3080 is supposedly around 30 TFLOPS, I think relative to Turing, it's going to look more like a 20 TFLOPS FP32 with 10 tera ops of integer. So that's, if you're wondering, hey, why is TFLOPS 3 times as high as the 2080 and we're not seeing triple the performance? That's kind of why it's the architecture stuff.
So let's see. Someone asks, what about the elephant in the room? Crypto mining performance. Should we be worried about that? Worried in what way? Worried that it's not good enough, or worried that people are
Worried
going
that
to
it's
buy
going to
it?
sell out. I think it was going to sell out for the next month or two without cryptocurrency mining. I ran a benchmark and I used Nice Hash Miner, which probably isn't the most optimized, and I ran it under Windows using the DHC drivers or DCH drivers, which probably aren't the most optimal for cryptocurrency mining right now. Like there's a bunch of caveats. Just straight out of the box, it got 80 mega hash per second on the ETH hash or Dagger Hashimoto hashing, which is almost twice as fast as the 2080 Ti. It is using 320, 330 watts, so it uses a little bit more power. I want to say like the net gains at 80 mega hash per second was, with current Ethereum prices, was estimated to be like $4 a day, or $3 a day, maybe. I can't remember. Someone else can look that up. No, it was $4 a day if you got up to 120 mega hash, which was the rumor. So we're really looking at closer to $2.50 to $3 a day, which means your break-even point, if everything stayed the same, would be 200 days roughly. And of course, it's cryptocurrency, so nothing is going to stay the same. It's volatile as anything, and it's going to go up and down. You could break even in 3 months. You could break even in 2 years. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty of miners that want to buy these cards. And I worry that it's going to be like a throwback to the 2017 days where you couldn't find reasonably priced GPUs. I guess it all depends on what happens with cryptocurrency prices. Like if they take a crash again, your miner interest will die off.
Yeah.
But if you have like an optimized miner where someone has gone and looked at the RTX 3080 architecture and tuned the code for that architecture, I think you're probably going to get at least 100 mega hash and possibly more.
Uh, Fizzy asks, do you think the initial launch price will go up?
Well, so if you go to Nvidia and you look at their store, it will be $699 plus tax and shipping or whatever, right? And Nvidia is really good about not changing their price on their store, but it will often not be in stock. All of the third-party cards sold at Newegg and Amazon and B&H and wherever, they're free to charge more. I want to say, we've seen some of the cards priced at 730, some 750, some $800. They're, bigger cards, bigger factory overclocks, things like that, more RGB lighting, and they're just custom cards that already carried a price premium. Their MSRP, maybe tops out at 800 right now. Scalping, price gouging, whatever you want to call it, I think you're going to see a lot of places charging more than $800 for the 3080. Because hey, last month they were selling a 2080 Ti for $1,000 to $1,200, and now you've got a card that's 30% faster. So yeah, they can try and charge up to $1,200 or more, and then the 3090 will launch. I'm hearing a lot of rumors, or it's not even rumors. I've heard from multiple people in the industry saying supply of these RTX 3080 GPUs is relatively tight, and the 3090 GPUs is severely tight, and that there's not going to be, a ton of availability. So even if you want a $1,500 graphics card next week, you might have to wait.
Wow. So would you pay to upgrade if you had a 2080?
Oh, I would, because I'm an enthusiast. I'm like super excited about this. Um, but it all depends on, like, the sensible approach is, what games do you play, what's your monitor, and do you really need to do the upgrade? But I'm looking at Watch Dogs Legion and Cyberpunk 2077, both of which have lots of new ray tracing effects added. If you Let's see, I let me try and find this. Let's see, I need to go to my bonus games. I got to get back into the bees. Okay, here we go. So there's two new benchmarks which some developers over in China have created. One is for a game called Bright Memory Infinite, and it uses a bunch of ray tracing effects. It's got reflections and refractions um and what are they called? I can't even think of the name. Caustics. There you go. It's got caustics. It's got uh, I can't remember all the terms, but it's got all the ray tracing effects, global illumination. If you crank all of those on and you do multi-bounce refractions and reflections, and you run with DLSS performance mode, which means you're rendering at 1080p and you're upscaling to 4K, the 3080 still only gets 53 frames per second. Um, then we've got the Boundary benchmark, which is a different developer, also out of China, but it also uses like a bunch of high-tech ray tracing effects. And again, DLSS performance mode, upscaling 1080p to 4K, you're looking at 52 frames per second on the 3080. So with all of the ray tracing effects enabled, I think that's probably going to be pretty dang representative of Cyberpunk 2077. So I'm sitting there going, yeah, if I want to do DLSS 4K with ray tracing and get close to 60 frames per second, I'm going to need a 3080. So that's my personal take. I'm super excited about Cyberpunk, and shoot me, I'm a Cyberpunk fan. I've read Neuromancer too many times and lots of other Cyberpunk books. So um, I would want this card. Will AMD's card be faster than it next month or whenever? I don't know, but probably not. Just because this is second
So
gen ray tracing from Nvidia, and I don't think AMD is going to match them with their first gen ray tracing part.
so this is the most important question you'll get all day, I'm sure. Worth it for
Yeah,
Cyberpunk at
at
1440?
1440, see, if I'm right, and this Boundary and Bright Memory Infinite benchmarks are representative of what's going to happen. Here I've got others. Here's Control with all the ray tracing effects. Control with DLSS, that scaled up to 85 frames per second, but it doesn't do as many ray tracing effects as some other games might. Like it doesn't do global illumination or refraction. So, Control, if Cyberpunk performs like that, that would be great. Let's see, Doom Eternal just cruises along. Death Stranding was just DLSS. Microsoft Flight Simulator, there's a very much CPU bound benchmark, not a very big jump from the 2080 Ti even at 4K Ultra. That's partly because it's DirectX 11. Horizon Zero Dawn, that's just a new game, no ray tracing effects. Metro Exodus, I didn't even. Yeah, there it is. So this is global illumination, ultra quality DLSS, and it's getting 60 frames per second with 4K upscaling. So again, I think that's possibly where Cyberpunk lands. Drop down to 1440p and your frame rate should go up. But I think if you want all the ray tracing effects enabled, there's still a good chance at 1440p you will have to run with DLSS to get above 60 frames per second. What
Hey,
else?
Jared, I think we have more search engine gold. I think you've got to either update our current Cyberpunk story to mention 3080 or
Oh yeah,
write a new one.
we'll
The
definitely be testing it when it comes out. That's all I know.
Yeah, we got to just definitely speculate on that because we know that Cyberpunk 27, like for those who are watching, we have an article on what you need to run Cyberpunk 2077. Now, obviously, nobody knows 100% for sure, or at least nobody outside of the game publisher knows 100% for sure, but we've been working on kind of speculating what you will need to get good performance out of Cyberpunk 2077, which is going to be the biggest game of the year when it comes out, hopefully in November as promised. So
Yeah. And my thought is right now CD Projekt Red, like they're trying to optimize it and tune it and make performance better than it currently is. And that's partly why the game's not out. They're debugging it too, but I'm sure there's a lot of it where they're like, "Oh my gosh, like with all these ray tracing things we put into it, performance is really slow and the gamers are going to be ticked and we don't want to have people whining about, "Oh my gosh, it's the next crisis, can your PC run Cyberpunk?" Um, that's just my guess, right? But I think it's going to be a very demanding game. Witcher 3 was very demanding when it came out, and so I don't think CD Projekt Red is going to step back and be like, "Yeah, our last game was one of the best selling games ever. Let's not do a game like that again."
so
Wolfenstein Youngblood, this is kind of interesting. It's only doing ray traced reflections. It's using the Vulkan API, but check this out. Even with DLSS in quality mode, so 1440p upscaled to 4K, it beats a 2080 Ti using 1080p upscaling. So
great. So we have time for one more question, and we are asked, by any chance, are there benchmarks for Star Citizen?
I didn't run them.
Okay.
So
Well,
I could try and download it and try it out, but I've never even tried the game. So figuring out how to benchmark it is a bit of a
yeah,
slog.
there's a lot of games. But anyhow, I encourage everyone to check out Jared's review on tomshardware.com for all the charts and all the details. We will have even more information coming out as more things happen. I also want to note we have some other related articles coming. We've got or out already. We have one on the CPU scaling. We have an article that I wrote on testing NVIDIA broadcast, which is not 3080, but it'll work with any RTX card and allows you to filter out. I'm not running it now, or I would have blurred my messy background. It allows you to blur your messy background. I think Jared is running it right now for auto framing because I see his cameras moving as
There, we'll do background blur for you instead.
yeah. But I have some cool. We
I've
have
also
some.
got noise cancellation running on my end. My headset probably does that as well, but the noise cancellation is actually really freaking impressive to me. Like you hear things where you're like, "Oh my gosh, it totally removed fan noise or traffic noise or, air conditioning noise from my audio." So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
pretty amazing.
it's really good. What I'm actually impressed to hear you have it on now, because I felt like when I was testing it, I lost a little bit of the fullness of my voice, which might have just been that I wasn't using my best microphone. But it seems like your voice, you haven't lost any fullness. But then again, you don't. I don't know if you have any really loud things going on behind you at the moment.
No, it's pretty quiet in my office. It's, it's only 7:15 in the morning over here. My kids probably aren't even awake.
So I think maybe it's smart, and it sort of cuts off the high end of the free whatever the high pitch stuff only when it's happening. But I tested it. Oh, okay. We have one more question, which we'll take, because the last question wasn't much of a uh, question that we could answer. Sidestepping a little, do we know for sure that the Zen 3 CPU is going to be 7 nanometer plus architecture after Apple's new 5 nanometer? I'm questioning if Zen 3 will use 5 nanometer.
So I'm pretty confident that AMD has gone on the record saying they're using 7 nanometer of some form. They haven't said whether it's the N7P or N7 Plus or whatever N from I think N6 is considered different than N7. So it's N7P or N7 Plus most likely, and I think the most likely option is N7P. I don't think it's going to be the exact same N7 node that was used on Zen 2, but I mean, I guess it could be. It comes down to supply and demand, and in this case, it's the supply of TSMC's wafers at a certain lithography node versus the demand from other customers. And Apple was the first company to use TSMC's N7 process, and now they're the first to use the N5 process. And Apple knows it's going to sell millions of iPhones and tablets and other stuff. And so it can order a lot of wafers and pay for them. And so that kind of makes it harder for other companies like AMD or Nvidia or even Intel or whoever to get in and buy those wafers for themselves. So my my best guess is that it's N7P.
So one more, but we can't really answer this with numbers because we haven't benchmarked the 3090 yet. I'm sure. I'm sure eventually we'll get to do it. But
3090.
we can't. But if we're doing anything with 3090, we couldn't talk about it because that would still be under embargo if we
I
had
can
one.
tell you I don't have a 3090 yet.
Uh, so
So
so we really
so
can't
I
say
can't
whether.
even give you numbers. What I can tell you though is like 3090 is over twice the price of the 3080. So I mean it's the Titan card that's at a it's not a $2,500 Titan RTX, but it is a $1,500 Titan XP basically, right? So if you saw the 1080 Ti and you went, yeah, there's no way I'm paying $1,200 for a Titan XP versus a $700 1080 Ti. Here we are 3 years later, and your choice is a $700 3080 or a $1,500 3090. And I don't think you need the 24 gigabytes for gaming, certainly. If you're doing certain professional workloads, like, yeah, you can probably justify it. I still don't think it's going to be a substantial boost to performance in most situations. On paper, it's 20% faster at best, which means it's probably 10 to 15% faster in real world applications. So I I'll have the review hopefully next week. I'm anticipating a card probably lands on my desk tomorrow now that the 3080 stuff is done, right? But yeah,
Yeah,
the 3090 it's going to be super interesting. I'm excited for it, but
yeah,
it's still
we don't know yet, and we couldn't talk yet about, I think, exactly when we would get the card or when the review is, but probably
well,
some.
we know that the cards launch on the 24th. So like I don't even know when when the actual review embargo is. Like this one, the review embargo was today, the day before launch. That's usually what you get, like 1 or 2 days before launch. But the 3090, obviously it's coming next week. We'll have a review by the launch date is all I know for sure.
Anyway, so thanks everyone. Please check out the articles on tomshardware.com, and please like and subscribe on YouTube so we can continue to alert people when we have these special broadcasts. See you soon. Bye.